The grey New York sky hung low over St. Patrick's Cathedral, a heavy shroud of granite and unshed rain that matched the leaden weight in my chest. I stood at the top of the marble steps, draped in black silk that felt like armor against the biting October wind, watching the procession of black SUVs stretch down Fifth Avenue. Beside me, my daughter, Julianne, stood as still as a statue, her face hidden behind a designer veil that seemed more like a mask than a sign of mourning. Her husband, Nathan, stood on her other side, his hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture that looked protective to the flashing cameras of the press, but to me, it felt proprietary, a claim staked on a grieving family. We had just buried Arthur Rivers, a man who began with nothing in the dirt of Kentucky and ended his life as the titan of a real estate empire that defined the Manhattan skyline. He was my husband for 40 years, my partner in every gamble, and the only person who truly knew the woman behind the Vance Rivers name. As the last of the dignitaries offered their rehearsed condolences, I felt a sharp, icy chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. It was the way Nathan looked at me, not with sympathy, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a predator who had finally seen the king fall and was now measuring the height of the throne. We returned to the estate in the Hamptons in a silence that was deafening, a thick atmosphere of unspoken agendas that made the sprawling mansion feel like a tomb. Arthur had built this house to be a sanctuary, a fortress of limestone and glass overlooking the Atlantic. But tonight, the lights felt too bright and the shadows too deep. I went to the library, the room that still smelled of Arthur's leather-bound books and the faint, lingering scent of his pipe tobacco. I needed a moment to breathe, to touch the mahogany desk where we had planned our first foundation grants. But I wasn't alone for long. The heavy doors clicked shut, and I turned to see Nathan standing there, already pouring himself a glass of Arthur's vintage scotch, as if the room already belonged to him. Julianne followed him, looking pale and restless, avoiding my eyes as she sat on the edge of a velvet armchair. Nathan didn't wait for the tea to be served or for the exhaustion of the funeral to settle. He set the glass down with a precise, metallic sound that echoed against the silence. "Mother," he began, using a title that always felt like a lie coming from his lips, "we need to talk about the transition of the Rivers Trust. Arthur's passing has left a massive vacuum in the management of the $75 million based in liquid assets, and the board is already expressing concerns about stability. Julianne and I have spent the last few hours reviewing the immediate requirements, and it's clear that the current structure is too cumbersome for someone in your state of grief." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs, a slow realization of betrayal beginning to seep into my bones. "Transition? Arthur only passed 3 days ago, and you are already discussing the liquidation of the trust we built over 4 decades. Nathan stepped closer, his shadow falling across Arthur's desk, eclipsing the light from the green-shaded lamp. He spoke with a modulated tone of professional concern that I now recognized as a weaponized form of deceit. "It's not about liquidation. It's about protection," he said, his voice dropping to a persuasive hum. "The markets are volatile, and the river's legacy is a target for predators. I've already taken the liberty of initiating a temporary freeze on the primary accounts to prevent any unauthorized fluctuations while we restructure the Oversight Committee." He gestured to a leather-bound folder on the desk, a binder full of legal jargon and authorization lines that I knew instinctively were the bars of a cage. "We need your signature on these streamlining documents, Mother. It will allow me to handle the day-to-day burdens so you can focus on your recovery. After all, the recent lapses in your bookkeeping for the Inner City Arts Grant were concerning." I looked at Julianne, my daughter, the child I had rocked through fevers and celebrated through every milestone of her life, searching for a spark of the loyalty I thought we shared. "Julianne," I whispered. Do you truly believe I am incapable of managing the legacy your father left to me? Do you think I would sign away the control of our history to a series of spreadsheets and committees? Julianne finally looked at me, but her blue eyes were dull, shielded by a wall of exhaustion and the subtle, persistent conditioning Nathan had spent years perfecting. Mum, Nathan is a lawyer. He knows the legal complexities we don't, she said, her voice sounding practiced and brittle. He says the evidence of the discrepancies in the trust is undeniable, and that if we don't act now, the federal oversight could be devastating. It's for the best, Mum. You're distraught, and you need to rest. The room felt as if it were shrinking, the air thick with the smell of old paper and the new cloying scent of Nathan's ambition. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just losing my husband. I was being systematically erased from my own life by the people I had trusted with my soul. The discrepancies he mentioned were ghosts, fabricated anomalies used to justify the seizure of power. Nathan had already moved the pieces on the board while I was mourning at the graveside. I thought of Arthur's warnings, his deep-seated caution about the predators that circle immense wealth, and I realized I had let my guard down at the most critical moment. I stood up, my knees cracking, but my back straight with the dignity that Arthur had always admired. I will not sign anything tonight, I said, my voice cold and hard like the limestone of the foundation. I am the matriarch of this family, and this house is still mine. I want you both to leave. Nathan didn't argue. He simply picked up the folder, his face a masterpiece of righteous sorrow that masked a lethal patience. Of course, Mother. We'll give you the night to reflect. But the bank freeze is already in effect, and the board has been notified of your condition. We only want to prevent a stain on the senator's legacy. He placed a proprietary hand on Julianne's shoulder and led her toward the door, leaving me alone in the vast, silent library. I listened to their footsteps fade down the marble hallway, the sound of my life being dismantled piece by piece. I sank back into Arthur's chair, the gold wedding band on my finger feeling like a heavy iron weight. The shock was receding, replaced by a cold, incandescent fury. They believed I was broken, a relic of a bygone era to be managed and eventually discarded. They had forgotten that I was the one who stood by Arthur Rivers when the world said we couldn't build an empire from nothing. I looked at the clock, 11 o'clock and 10 minutes at night. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon reflecting off the restless Atlantic. My mind, sharp despite the exhaustion, began to recall the hidden layers of defense Arthur had mentioned during our last quiet evening together. He had spoken of keys, not physical keys, but names, relationships, and a network of loyalty that ran deeper than any bank account Nathan could freeze. The first key was the old desk key, he had said. I reached under the mahogany surface of the desk, feeling for the small, hidden compartment we had designed 30 years ago. My fingers brushed a cold piece of metal, a small silver key that had sat undisturbed for decades. As I held it in my hand, I realized the war for the river's legacy had officially begun, and I would not be the one to surrender. I spent the next hour at my computer, or what was left of it. Nathan had already restricted my access to the main trust servers, but he didn't know about the private encrypted drive Arthur had installed for our sensitive political communications. I logged in, my fingers flying over the keys with a precision I hadn't used in years. There it was. Operation Phoenix, a series of files labeled Hostile Internal Takeover, containing the digital blueprints of every asset, every shell corporation, and every loyalist Robert had cultivated in Washington and New York. My husband had seen this coming, not the specifics of Nathan's betrayal, but the inevitability of the vultures circling once the lion was gone. He had built a fortress around me, and I was finally standing inside the command post. I realized Nathan's mistake was his overconfidence. He believed that by isolating me, cutting off my funds, and whispering lies to my daughter, he had neutralized me. He saw a grieving widow. He didn't see the woman who had helped broker peace deals and manage a billion-dollar empire from the shadows. I reached for the phone, the secure, scrambled line that Nathan didn't know existed, and dialed the number of the one person I knew would still answer to the name of Rivers. The line clicked, and the voice of Mr. Chibeo Harrington, the senator's chief counsel for 40 years, answered on the first ring. "James," I said, my voice steady for the first time since the funeral. "It's Eleanor. The vultures are in the house, and they've already begun liquidating the municipal bonds. I need the second key." Harrington didn't ask for explanations. He knew the stakes. "The second key is the name of the man who manages the offshore security vault," he replied, his voice dry and precise as always. "You'll find it in the Geneva files under the heading Sovereign Integrity." "And Eleanor?" "Warden Sterling has been notified. He is waiting for your signal." I hung up, a cold measure of satisfaction beginning to replace the nausea. Nathan Thorne and his mother, Vivian, were enjoying their champagne tonight, believing they had secured a $75 million prize. They were about to discover that the Rivers legacy wasn't just built on money, it was built on a foundation of loyalty and ironclad justice that they were entirely incapable of understanding. The battle was no longer just about the house or the accounts. It was about the soul of my daughter and the dignity of the life Arthur and I had built together. As the first rays of a grey dawn began to peek through the library windows, I stood at the window, watching the tide roll in. The fall had been sudden and brutal, designed to break me, but the ascent was being planned with the meticulous care of a master strategist. I was Audrey Rivers, and this was only the beginning. Nathan Thorne believed he had locked me in a cage of his own making, but he had merely given me the solitude I needed to finish what Arthur had started. The time for silence was over. The time for the reckoning was imminent. The morning sun filtered through the curtainless windows of the Hamptons estate, but its warmth felt like a cruel mockery of the cold reality settling into the marrow of my bones. I sat in the breakfast nook, a space that had once been filled with the aroma of Arthur's favourite biscuits and the vibrant energy of a family on the rise. But today it felt like forbidden territory. Nathan was already there, his dark suit perfectly tailored for a day of dismantling my life, while his mother, Vivian, sat across from him draped in silk that hummed with the sound of old money and new greed. They were looking at a series of architectural plans spread across the mahogany table where Arthur and I used to plan our foundation's future. I watched them from the doorway, feeling like a ghost in the house I had built with the hands of my late husband. Every brick in these walls, every beam in the ceiling, represented a fulfilled promise from a man who started with nothing in the mines of Kentucky and ended as a titan of industry. We moved to New York when I was only 18, sharing a cramped room in the South End, scrubbing clothes until my knuckles bled to save every cent for a future we believed in. Now that future was being discussed as a set of assets to be modernized and liquidated. Vivian didn't even look up when I entered, her painted nails tapping rhythmically against a blueprint for the Thorne legacy wing. "We simply must have the senator's portrait taken down before the gala," she insisted, her voice a sharp, undeniable blade of intent. "It casts a pall over the entire room, and it's time to move toward a more contemporary aesthetic." I felt a spike of white-hot rage through my gut. That portrait was the soul of this house, the image of the man who had given everything so Julianne could grow up in luxury. Nathan finally looked at me, but his expression was a masterpiece of rehearsed sorrow. "Mother, we've taken the liberty of organizing the movers for the storage company. he said, his voice carrying the perfect modulated tone of public grief. We need to streamline the environment to help you focus on your recovery. The humiliation was a slow-acting poison designed to erode my confidence bit by bit. They began by moving the furniture, changing the curtains, and putting the dishes Arthur and I had picked out together into the back of the cabinets. Then they took control of the kitchen, the heart of my home. Vivian would enter with an annoyed expression, complaining that the coffee was too weak or that my presence was simply in the way. I remembered preparing Arthur's packed lunch before dawn, preparing every meal with a heart that never stopped beating for the family that was my reason for existing. Now, I was being treated as a tenant in my own life, a burden to be managed until I could be moved to a more appropriate facility. Julianne entered the room then, looking pale and fragile, wrapped in a designer trench coat that seemed like a shroud for her former self. She sat at the table with her head bowed, eating in silence while her husband and mother-in-law discussed the repositioning of her father's legacy. "Mum, Nathan says the evidence of the discrepancies in the trust is ironclad," she whispered, her voice sounding practiced and brittle. "He says that if we don't consolidate the funds into the new entity, the legal fallout could be devastating for all of us." I looked at my daughter, searching for the girl I had raised to be strong, to speak truth to power, but I saw only a victim of profound emotional manipulation. Nathan had isolated her, eroding her judgment until she could no longer differentiate between his control and her own survival. He made her believe that her testimony was an act of mercy, a way to protect the family name from my supposed mental decline. It was a systematic stripping away of my dignity, orchestrated by the man who was meant to protect us. I retreated to the library, the only room that still felt like it belonged to the memory of Arthur. I thought about our first son, Jeff, who had gone west years ago to find his own way, and the daughter we lost to a fever no doctor could cure. We had endured the terrible weight of that absence together, building this house as a piece of future for the children we had left. Arthur had laid every brick with his own hands, mixed every bucket of cement, refusing breaks because he wanted to give me something more than the wooden walls of Oak Creek. Now those walls were being closed off to me, one by one. Nathan had perfected the art of silent cruelty. He didn't yell or make scenes. He simply stopped putting a plate for me at the table and put away the leftovers where I couldn't reach them. He prepared exact amounts of food for himself, Vivian, and Julianne, and if I was hungry, I was left to manage for myself. The nights were the hardest, the silence of the house filled with the whispers of their conspiracy. I would leave my room like a ghost, walking barefoot down the cold hallway to the kitchen, chewing a piece of dry bread as a small victory against the woman who wanted to erase me. It was on one of those nights that I heard Nathan's voice from the study, sharp and full of poorly contained rage. "I can't stand her presence anymore," he was telling Julianne. "She's old, she's distraught, she's just in the way. We need to move the remaining $20 million out of the country by Friday and finalize the guardianship papers." Julianne's voice sounded tired and defeated as she asked if I would notice the transfer. "She doesn't notice anything anymore," Nathan replied with a smirk that I could feel through the door. I sat on the floor of the hallway, the bread turning to stone in my throat, as I realized the full extent of the betrayal. They were planning to have me declared incompetent, take control of the $75 million, and put me in some cheap assisted living facility where I could rot while they enjoyed the fruits of Arthur's sweat. My own daughter was agreeing to have me institutionalized to speed up the inevitable. I felt like I no longer had the strength to continue, the sunlight of my life turning grey as the sunlight had the day Arthur died. But dawn has a strange way of changing things, and as the first light peeked through the window, I felt a determination I hadn't felt in years. I remembered the silver key in the hidden compartment of Arthur's desk and the files labeled Operation Phoenix. Nathan believed I was a relic to be managed, but he had forgotten that I was the one who stood by the senator during every political storm. I began to document everything, taking photographs of the fraudulent papers Nathan, left in his briefcase and recording their conversations when they thought I was disoriented. I captured hours of them discussing the streamlining of accounts and the movement of the big money to the Caymans. Every humiliation, every meal I was denied, and every lie they told about my memory was kept as evidence in my heart and on the secure drive Arthur had installed. Nathan was already enjoying my home in the Hamptons, uncorking champagne and laughing about the old bat going down so easily, but he was making the critical mistake of leaving me alive with the means to fight back. I contacted James Harrington, the senator's chief counsel, using the secure scrambled line Nathan didn't know existed. James confirmed that Nathan had already begun liquidating assets, including the Jackson Pollock painting and municipal bonds, with a greed that was not subtle. "We need to catch them in the act of the federal wire fraud," James told me. "You need to stay put and play the part of the defeated widow until they cross that international line." I spent the days acting as if I were sinking into the fog they had designed for me, letting them scold me for forgetting things and allowing Nathan to pressure me with the power of attorney documents. I watched them through the surveillance feed Arthur had installed years ago, a bizarre reality show where I was the only witness to my own dismantling. Vivian had already started planning the Thorne Legacy Gala, a vulgar celebration of their perceived victory where they planned to take down Arthur's portrait and announce the launch of their own foundation. I watched Julianne clutch an ice bucket in the kitchen, her lower lip trembling as Vivian ordered her to organize the movers for the storage company, her spirit completely broken. The sight of my daughter's absolute defeat was a colder shock than any silent meal or cold hallway. I wasn't just fighting for my reputation or the millions in the trust. I was fighting for Julianne's emancipation from the sociopath she had married. I recited Arthur's full name, Senator Robert Sterling Vance, over and over as a mantra of survival, focusing on the third key that would link the old guard to the new power. Nathan believed he had buried me, but he had merely given me the command post for the war that was about to begin. Every calorie of the grey meals I was served was fuel for the fight. Every humiliation a piece of evidence for the reckoning. The fall had been agonizing, designed to strip away my dignity and my life's work. But the ascent was being authorized by a loyalty that ran deeper than any bank account. I was Audrey Rivers, and while they toasted their success in my library, I was preparing the final strike that would restore the integrity of the Vance legacy and free my daughter from the velvet cage Nathan had built around her. The darkness that settled over the estate was not merely the absence of light, but a suffocating, tactile weight that seemed to seep from the very walls Arthur and I had built with such hope. I sat in my room, the small back space that had once been a cheerful pantry, and was now my silent cell, listening to the house creak like a ship breaking apart in a storm. My stomach scratched with a hollow hunger that no one else heard, a silence growing from within as I stared at the cracked floor tiles in the dim light of a flickering bulb. For 2 days, I had survived on hard bread and water, hiding my miserable meals like a criminal, because I could no longer face the poisoned glares Lauren directed at me whenever I ventured toward the kitchen. The aroma of chicken casserole would float through the hallways, a cruel mockery of the life I once led, while Lauren stirred the pots with the arrogance of an owner. I felt invisible, a burden to the daughter who had once promised to care for me, now reduced to a ghost haunting the corridors of my own legacy. Nathan's campaign of psychological warfare had reached its peak, a systematic stripping away of my autonomy that made every breath feel like a struggle against drowning. He had perfected the art of silent cruelty, ensuring that my bank accounts remained frozen and my movements were monitored by the security staff he had hired to replace my loyal housekeepers. I had listened to their conversations through the thin walls, my heart turning to stone as I heard my own daughter, Julianne, discuss my deterioration with a clinical coldness. Nathan spoke of me as an obstacle between him and $75 million, a figure he threw around with the same casualness one might use for a grocery list. They were planning to have me declared incompetent, citing erratic behavior and fabricated memory lapses that they had carefully documented over the weeks. I had found the draft of the conservatorship application hidden in Nathan's briefcase, a document that claimed I was a danger to myself and required immediate legal guardianship. The betrayal was a moral cancer that ate at my spirit. But even in the depths of that abyss, I was not yet defeated. Under the loose floorboards of my room, I kept a secret that Nathan, with all his ambition, and Julianne, with all her passivity, could never imagine. It was an old tin box, rusty at the corners, containing the yellowed, fragile papers that Arthur had entrusted to me years ago. Among the faded photos and old letters lay the deeds to a piece of land on the road to Albany, a lot that had been worthless when Arthur inherited it in 1970, but which was now situated directly across from a multi-million-dollar luxury development. Nathan believed he had seized every asset, but he was blind to the black box funds and the dormant properties that Arthur had shielded from standard accounting. This land was legally mine, passed to me as the surviving spouse, because Arthur had died without a formal will for his private holdings. One afternoon, a man who introduced himself as Dr. Sanchez arrived at the house, brought by Nathan for a routine checkup that I knew was a trap. I saw the glances they exchanged, the condescending tone the doctor used as he asked me the day of the week and the name of the president. I remembered the notes in Nathan's files about a doctor willing to cooperate for money, and I realized this was the corrupt professional they were paying to certify my incompetence. I answered every question with a steely, quiet precision, refusing to give them the ammunition they craved. But the fear remained. If they presented a medical opinion to a cautious judge, even a fraudulent one, it could cost me everything before I had a chance to fight back. The turning point came when Nathan, fueled by his own arrogance, began to move the big money. I watched the surveillance feed on the hidden monitor, seeing him in Arthur's home office with a thick red binder, the final liquidation papers. He was talking to a known operative in a tax haven, his charm replaced by a frantic nervousness as he insisted on moving $20 million out of the country by Friday. "We need to close the Rivers Foundation," he hissed into the phone. "Transfer everything into Thorn Global Philanthropy." He was crossing the line into federal wire fraud, and he was doing it in the house my husband had built on a foundation of integrity. I reached out to Warden David Sterling, the man who owed Arthur his career and his dignity. Sterling had been a state trooper whose name was cleared by Arthur years ago, and he had been waiting for the moment to pay that debt. Through a secure, scrambled line, Sterling put me in touch with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. He managed my security with a hand-picked staff, maintaining the illusion that I was a broken, compliant widow while I acted as the eyes and ears inside Nathan's operation. I spent my days acting disoriented for the benefit of the cameras Nathan had installed. But at night, I was a general in a tactical operations center, reconstructing every transaction and identifying every forged signature. The most painful discovery, however, was not the financial fraud, but the depth of Nathan's manipulation of Julianne. I saw her on the feed, huddled and rocking on the grand staircase, watching the house be stripped of its history. Nathan had criticized her friends, her choices, and finally her sanity, until she believed she was incapable of living without his protection. He had purchased her silence with designer clothes and a new Bentley, a gilded muzzle for a daughter who had once been the light of Arthur's eyes. The sight of her broken spirit was a colder shock than any prison cell, and it forged in me a purpose that went beyond justice. By the end of the second week, the net was closing. Sterling had confirmed that the wire transfer was scheduled for 10 o'clock on Friday morning. I sat in my small room, my hands no longer shaking, watching the clock move with agonizing slowness. I had documented the conspiracy, recorded the confessions, and secured the medical evaluation from a reputable neurologist that proved my mind was perfectly healthy. Nathan and Vivian were uncorking champagne in the library, laughing about how easily the old bat had gone down, oblivious to the fact that their every word was being captured for a federal grand jury. The shock was over. The pain had been harnessed into a single, burning purpose. I was Audrey Rivers, and while they believed I was a relic to be managed, I was preparing the final strike. The house felt cold, but the fire within me was enough to burn down every lie they had ever told. I had the third key, the name of the loyalists who still served the memory of the senator, and I was ready to authorize the ascent. The darkness was absolute, but the dawn was coming, and with it, a reckoning that would decimate Nathan Thorne's empire of deceit. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck 10, each chime sounding like a funeral knell for the lies Nathan had meticulously spun. I stood behind the heavy oak door of Arthur's study, my hand resting on the cool brass handle, watching through a slim gap as the hallway swarmed with activity. The silence of the previous weeks had been replaced by a frantic, predatory energy. Nathan was barking orders at the movers, his voice sharp with a triumph he hadn't yet earned, while Vivian directed the packing of the Rivers family heirlooms as if she were reclaiming spoils of war. Julianne stood near the window, her silhouette thin and brittle against the morning light, her eyes fixed on the driveway where a black limousine waited to take me to the wellness center, the sanitized name Nathan had given to my exile. They thought they were witnessing the final act of a tragedy, but I knew the curtain was only just rising on their reckoning. I walked into the room, my steps silent on the Persian rug, and for a moment, they didn't even notice me. Nathan was holding the red binder, his thumb hovering over the biometric scanner of the encrypted laptop Arthur had left behind. He was about to initiate the wire transfer, the $20 million that would vanish into the labyrinthine accounts of the Cayman Islands. It was the definitive act of federal wire fraud, the point of no return. I cleared my throat, a small sound that felt like an explosion in the room. Nathan froze, his eyes snapping to mine with a mixture of annoyance and cold disdain. "Mother, you're supposed to be in your room," he said, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that turned my stomach. "The car is waiting. We've already handled the logistics. It's time for you to let go." I didn't move. I didn't tremble. I reached into the pocket of my black cardigan and pulled out the small silver key, the one Arthur had hidden for this exact moment. "I haven't let go of anything, Nathan," I said, my voice resonating with a strength that made Julianne flinch. "In fact, I've been holding on to quite a lot, including the recording of your conversation with Dr. Sanchez last Tuesday." The room went deathly still. Vivian stopped mid-motion, a crystal vase held in her hands like a weapon. Nathan laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Recordings? Mother, you're confused. The grief has been hard on your mind. That's why we're doing this. For your protection." I stepped toward the desk, the space that Nathan had desecrated with his ambition. My mind flickered back to the early days in New York, when Arthur and I had nothing but a shared dream and a relentless work ethic. We had built this empire on the principles of transparency and loyalty, values that Nathan viewed as weaknesses to be exploited. I looked at my daughter, Julianne, whose face was a mask of confusion and mounting dread. "Julianne, your husband has spent the last month documenting my decline, while he systematically drained the trust your father intended for the city's children. He didn't just want the money. He wanted the power to erase the river's name and replace it with Thorn. And you were going to let him do it because he convinced you that you were too weak to stand alone. Nathan's face contorted, the mask of the professional son-in-law slipping to reveal the raw, ugly greed beneath. "Enough of this," he hissed, stepping toward me with a menacing posture. "You're signing those papers, and you're leaving this house today. I don't care if I have to carry you to that car myself." He reached for my arm, but before his fingers could touch my skin, the heavy front doors of the mansion were thrown open with a force that shook the foundation. The sound of heavy boots echoed on the marble floors, and a voice of absolute authority cut through the air. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody move." The room was flooded with agents in blue windbreakers, their movements precise and practiced. Nathan froze, his hand still outstretched toward me, his face draining of color until he looked like a ghost of the man who had been laughing minutes ago. Standing at the front of the group was Warden David Sterling, his expression as stern and unyielding as the prison walls he managed. Behind him stood James Harrington, the senator's chief counsel, holding a briefcase that I knew contained the physical evidence of every forged signature and every illegal transaction Nathan had attempted. "Audrey," James said, nodding to me with a grim respect. "The wire transfer was intercepted at the gateway. The digital footprint is complete." I watched as the agents began to secure the room, their gloved hands moving through Nathan's files with a clinical efficiency. Vivian dropped the crystal vase, and the sound of it shattering on the floor seemed to signal the total collapse of their world. Nathan tried to speak, his voice a pathetic stutter of legalities and denials. "This is a misunderstanding," he managed to gasp, looking at Sterling. "I am a respected member of the bar. My mother-in-law is suffering from severe cognitive impairment. I was merely managing the estate in her best interest." Warden Sterling stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Nathan with a cold, piercing intensity. "Respected members of the bar don't bribe doctors to commit perjury, Mr. Thorne, nor do they attempt to move $20 million into shell corporations registered to their own names while the owner is still breathing. We have the logs, the recordings, and the testimony of the staff you tried to replace. You're under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit a felony." The sight of Nathan being forced into handcuffs was a moment of profound, icy clarity. For weeks he had treated me as a relic, a broken object to be discarded, but now he was the one being restrained, his power stripped away in a matter of seconds. He looked at Julianne, a desperate, silent plea in his eyes, but for the first time in years, my daughter didn't move toward him. She stood by the window, her breath coming in ragged gasps, as she watched the man she thought was her savior being led away in disgrace. Vivian followed, her poise shattered, her screams of indignation echoing through the hallway until they were cut off by the closing of the SUV door. The house fell into a strange, heavy silence, the air still thick with the scent of the tea I hadn't finished, and the dust the agents had kicked up. James Harrington walked over to me, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. "It's over, Audrey," he whispered. "The accounts are being restored, and the river's trust is secure. Arthur would have been proud of how you held the line." I looked around the room, the library that had been my sanctuary and my prison, and felt a wave of exhaustion so deep it threatened to pull me under. But I couldn't rest yet. There was still the matter of my daughter. I walked over to Julianne, who was now huddled in the armchair, her face buried in her hands. The designer veil she had worn to the funeral lay discarded on the floor, a symbol of the mask she had been forced to wear. "Julianne," I said softly, sitting on the edge of the chair. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen, the arrogance Nathan had instilled in her completely gone. Mom, I'm so sorry, she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. He told me you were sick. He told me the money was disappearing because of your mistakes. I was so scared of losing everything, of the scandal. I didn't know. I took her hands in mine, feeling the fine tremors that shook her body. You chose to believe the lie because it was easier than facing the truth, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. But the river's legacy isn't about the money, Julianne. It's about the strength to stand up when the world tells you to lie down. You have a long road ahead to earn back the trust you broke, but you are still my daughter, and this house is still your home. The reclamation of my life was not a sudden event, but a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding. In the days that followed, the FBI continued their investigation, uncovering a web of corruption that extended far beyond Nathan Thorne. He had been part of a network of predators who targeted wealthy widows, using legal loopholes and psychological manipulation to strip them of their autonomy. My case became the catalyst for a federal crackdown, a movement for justice that I led with the same quiet determination that I had used to build the empire with Arthur. I transformed my pain into a weapon, using the river's foundation to establish the Dignity Fund, a legal resource for those who found themselves isolated and betrayed by the people they trusted most. The humiliation that had once threatened to drown me became the foundation of my new strength. I was no longer just the widow of Arthur Rivers. I was the architect of a new kind of justice. I walked through the Hamptons estate, the sun finally breaking through the grey New York clouds, and for the first time in months, I felt the warmth on my skin. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a fortress again. But this time, the walls were built on the truth. The fall had been brutal, designed to break me, but the rise was absolute. I had defended my legacy, saved my daughter, and proven that the spirit of a woman who has fought for everything can never be truly broken. The mahogany doors of the Southern District Court of New York swung open with a heavy, ceremonial thud that echoed through the marble rotunda, a sound that felt like the closing of a tomb for the Thorne family's social aspirations. I walked down the center aisle, the clicking of my heels on the polished stone sounding like a countdown. I chose a tailored suit of charcoal grey, a colour that signalled neither mourning nor celebration, but a cold, clinical resolve. To my left, the gallery was packed with the elite of Manhattan, people who had dined at my table for decades, now leaning forward with a voyeuristic hunger to see the fall of the House of Rivers. But I didn't look at them. My gaze was fixed on the defense table, where Nathan Thorne sat, stripped of his smugness, his expensive Italian suit now looking like a cheap costume. Beside him sat his mother, Vivian, her face heavily powdered to hide the cracks of a crumbling facade, her hands clutching a designer handbag as if it were a life raft in a rising tide. The trial was not just about money. It was about the systematic attempt to erase a human being's soul for the sake of a balance sheet. James Harrington stood at the podium, his voice a calm, rhythmic blade that dissected Nathan's defense before it could even begin. He presented the digital footprints, the breadcrumbs of greed that Nathan thought he had swept away. Every redirected wire transfer, every forged signature on the medical guardianship papers, and every private message between Nathan and the corrupt Dr. Sanchez was projected onto a massive screen for the jury to see. It was a forensic autopsy of a betrayal. I watched the jurors' faces change from confusion to a deep, visceral disgust as the evidence laid bare the cold-blooded nature of the conspiracy. They saw the Wellness Center brochure, a facility that was little more than a high-end prison for the elderly, where Nathan had planned to disappear me forever. When it was my turn to take the stand, the courtroom fell into a silence so absolute I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I climbed the steps to the witness box, feeling the weight of Arthur's memory like a steadying hand on my shoulder. Nathan's lawyer, a man whose reputation was built on bullying the vulnerable, approached me with a predatory smile. "Mrs. Rivers," he began, his voice dripping with a false saccharine empathy, "you've had a very difficult year. The loss of your husband, the sudden responsibility of a vast estate. Is it possible that your memory of these events is colored by the significant trauma and cognitive fog that naturally follows such a loss? Is it possible you simply misunderstood your son-in-law's attempts to protect the family from your own lapses in judgment?" I looked him directly in the eye, my voice coming out steady and clear, echoing with the authority of a woman who had spent 40 years managing the complexities of a multi-billion-dollar empire. "Trauma does not cause one to hallucinate wire transfers to the Cayman Islands, counselor," I replied. "And grief does not fabricate the sound of my son-in-law laughing about how easily he could institutionalize me while drinking my late husband's scotch. My memory is quite sharp. I remember the exact date Nathan Thorne began his campaign of isolation. I remember the meals I was denied. I remember the coldness in my daughter's voice when she told me I was no longer capable of choosing my own path. These are not lapses in judgment. They are the calculated steps of a man who viewed a grieving widow as an inconvenient obstacle to a $75 million prize." I reached into my folder and produced the final, devastating piece of evidence, the third key. It was a letter Nathan had written to his mother, Vivian, months before Arthur had even fallen ill, detailing a long-term acquisition strategy for the Rivers' assets. He had been planning this since the moment he married Julianne. The courtroom gasped as the letter was read aloud, a blueprint for a hostile takeover of a family, written with the cold precision of a corporate merger. Vivian Thorne let out a strangled sob, but there was no sympathy for her in that room. The social standing they had spent a lifetime cultivating vanished in the span of a single afternoon. The headlines the next morning didn't speak of the tragic decline of Audrey Rivers. They screamed of the Thorne family's criminal greed. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Nathan was found guilty on all counts: federal wire fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. As the judge read the sentence, the weight of the past month seemed to lift from the room, replaced by a profound sense of justice. Nathan was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed, finally realizing that the woman he tried to break was the one who had ultimately dismantled him. Vivian was named as a co-conspirator, her assets frozen and her reputation in the Manhattan social circuit obliterated. She would spend the rest of her years in a small, modest apartment in Queens, a far cry from the mansions she had tried to steal. But the most difficult confrontation happened outside the courtroom, beneath the grey sky of a New York winter. Julianne was waiting for me near the fountain, her face pale and her eyes hollowed out by the realization of what she had allowed to happen. "Mom," she whispered, the words sounding like a plea for a life that no longer existed. "I didn't know about the letter. I didn't know he was planning it for so long. I thought I was protecting you." I looked at my daughter, seeing the traces of the girl I once knew buried beneath the wreckage of Nathan's manipulation. "Understanding is not the same as forgiveness, Julianne," I said, my heart aching with a mixture of love and disappointment. "You allowed your husband to treat your mother like an inmate. You watched me wither in that house, and you chose to look away because it was easier than standing up for the truth." I handed her a small envelope, not money, but a set of keys to a small farmhouse in upstate New York, far from the toxic luxury of the Hamptons. "You won't be living in the mansion anymore," I told her. "The Rivers Trust will provide for your basic needs, but you will work for the Dignity Fund. You will spend your days helping other families navigate the same shadows that nearly consumed us. You have to earn back your soul, Julianne. You have to learn what it means to be a Rivers again." She took the keys, her hands trembling, and for the first time in a decade, I saw a spark of genuine humility in her eyes. It was the beginning of a long, painful road to redemption, but it was a road she would walk with her own feet. As I drove away from the courthouse, I looked at the New York skyline, the buildings Arthur and I had helped build, the parks we had funded, the legacy that was now secure. The systematic dismantling of the Thorn influence was complete. Every board Nathan had sat on, every club Vivian had belonged to, and every project they had touched was being scrubbed clean of their presence. I was no longer the widow being managed. I was the architect of a new era. I had turned my pain into a fortress, and my betrayal into a shield for others. The ascent was absolute, and as I looked into the rearview mirror, I didn't see a woman broken by trauma. I saw a woman who had found her true power in the wreckage of her old life. The golden hour in the Hamptons always had a way of making the world feel like it was painted in liquid honey, but this evening, the light felt different. It was no longer the backdrop for a life I was merely observing from the sidelines. It was the illumination of a kingdom reclaimed. I walked along the shoreline, the damp sand firm beneath my feet, watching the Atlantic waves retreat and return with a rhythmic persistence that reminded me of my own journey. The salt air, once stinging with the scent of my isolation, now tasted like freedom. Behind me, the limestone fortress that Arthur and I had built stood tall against the darkening sky, its windows glowing with a soft, welcoming warmth that had been missing for far too long. The vultures were gone. The silence that once suffocated me had been replaced by a profound, soul-deep peace. I spent the morning at Arthur's graveside, a place that had once been a site of unbearable agony, but had now become a sanctuary of reflection. I sat on the stone bench we had chosen together years ago, my fingers tracing the carved letters of his name. Senator Robert Sterling Rivers. I told him about the Dignity Fund, about the hundreds of women who were now finding their voices because I had refused to lose mine. I told him that the $75 million was no longer just a figure on a ledger. It was a living, breathing force for justice. I felt his presence there, not as a ghost, but as a steadying hand on my shoulder, whispering that the legacy was safe. I realized then that the greatest gift Arthur had left me wasn't the real estate or the offshore accounts. It was the absolute certainty that integrity is the only currency that never devalues. Nathan Thorne had been sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, a stark, grey reality that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. Vivian was gone from the social registers, her name a cautionary tale whispered in the powder rooms of the Upper East Side. But my focus wasn't on their punishment, it was on the reconstruction of what they had tried to destroy. The Dignity Fund's national expansion was moving faster than I had anticipated. We were opening offices in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Dallas, creating a network of legal sentinels to protect the elderly from the very predators I had faced. I was no longer just a widow. I was a commander in a war for human dignity, using the very tools of power that Nathan had tried to use against me. The most delicate part of my rebirth was Julianne. She arrived at the house later that afternoon, her car a modest sedan instead of the luxury vehicles she had once craved. She looked different, tired, but for the first time in her adult life, she looked awake. She had been working at the Newark branch of the fund, processing intake forms for women who had been stripped of their homes by predatory relatives. She sat across from me in the breakfast nook, the same place where Nathan had once tried to starve me of my autonomy. She didn't ask for money or for a return to her old life. She simply asked if she could help me plant the new rose garden Arthur had always wanted. We worked in silence for hours, our hands deep in the soil, the physical labor acting as a bridge over the chasm of betrayal that had once separated us. I watched my daughter prune a thorn from a young bush, and I saw a glimpse of the woman she was becoming, a woman who understood that privilege is a responsibility, not a right. The reconciliation was not a sudden burst of forgiveness. It was a slow, intentional grafting of two broken lives. I knew I might never fully forget the way she looked at me during the darkest weeks, but I was learning to forgive her for her weakness, just as I was learning to forgive myself for my own vulnerability. We were building a new relationship on a foundation of honesty, one that Nathan's lies could never penetrate. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and streaks of defiant orange, I stood on the veranda and looked out at the estate. The Thorn legacy signs had long been torn down and burned. In their place stood a simple plaque near the entrance, "The River's Sanctuary for Justice." I thought about the moments when I was huddled in the dark pantry, chewing on dry bread and wondering if my life had any meaning left. I realized that the fall was necessary for the rise to be so magnificent. I had to be stripped of everything to realize that the core of who I was, the daughter of a coal miner, the partner of a visionary, the mother of a struggling soul, was indestructible. The scars of the betrayal remained, of course. There were nights when a sudden noise in the hallway would make my heart race, or a certain tone of voice would bring back the chill of Nathan's condescension. But those scars were no longer signs of shame. They were medals of honor. They were proof that I had entered the abyss and returned with my soul intact. I had leveraged my pain into a fountain of generosity, finding not just a return to my old life, but the creation of a brilliant, purposeful, new beginning. The debt to Arthur's legacy was paid in full. The debt to my own dignity was settled. I went inside and sat at Arthur's mahogany desk, opening the red binder one last time. I didn't look at the bank balances or the property deeds. I looked at a photograph of us from 40 years ago, standing in front of our first apartment in Queens, leaning on each other with a fierce, unbreakable love. I realized then that the most valuable asset I possessed wasn't in a vault in Geneva or a trust in Manhattan. It was the resilience that allowed me to turn a wound of treachery into a legacy of hope. I closed the binder and turned off the lamp, the darkness no longer a threat, but a soft blanket of peace. I was Audrey Rivers, and I was finally home. Forgetting the shame of being a victim is the final act of the survivor. I had spent so long blaming myself for not seeing the snake in my own garden, for allowing my grief to be used as a weapon against me. But standing in the light of the truth, I realized that my vulnerability was not a flaw. It was the mark of a heart that dared to love deeply. To anyone standing in the shadows of a betrayal that feels like a burial, the dirt they throw on you is not your end. It is the soil in which you will grow stronger. Forgive yourself for the trust you gave to the untrustworthy. Your dignity is not something that can be stolen, it can only be reclaimed. In the end, the greatest revenge is not the fall of your enemies, but the height of your own rebirth.